But Huck, as we alluded to, and as I know at least some of the stories, especially you and the family had the opportunity during your career to move around a bunch. And I think that's one of both the benefits and perhaps most interesting parts of integration in this sort of work is you could in theory go move to a place for a year or two and go work on some projects. And we've talked about a couple in the comments, but would you be willing to go tell us some of those stories as to how you guys got to moving around the world a little bit, and some of those positives and maybe some of those negatives?
Yeah, for sure. So it all started. I grew up in the Midwest, Kansas City, Missouri, and that first job was in Kansas City. And this company they built custom control systems, and they expanded to Australia because they were working in the grain industry, and the market in the US wasn't very good, but it was great in Australia. So they started selling their gear and their solutions to Australian grain processing factories. And so 2 years out of college, I'm this Midwestern kid who I've seen the East Coast. I don't think I'd ever even seen the West Coast of the US. I get sent to Australia
Okay.
and actually had a layover in Singapore on my first trip out of the country. So here I am walking around in the streets of Singapore, in the city of Singapore, and all of a sudden my world just expanded
Yeah.
tremendously. And so I went and did the thing in Australia. It ended up being like a 3 month assignment, and it was great. I just getting to experience another culture and seeing how other people live and go about their days was really interesting to me. From that point on, I watched for those opportunities, and whenever there was one, I took it. And fast forward a couple of years, and I'm newly married, and I come home and I say to my new wife, Nancy, "Hey, how would you like to go live in Australia?" And she says, "Not yes, but hell yes." And so there was this big project that this SI had over there, and I was going to be their local expert on the technologies that they had built and were deploying. And so it was 2 years. We lived in Sydney for the first year. During the design phase, it was an aluminum smelter that I mentioned earlier. And they spent the first year doing the design in Sydney, and then we moved up the coast an hour and a half or so to a town called Newcastle,
Mhm.
and where we started up this. It was actually an expansion to an existing facility, but we started up this brand new part of this facility with all this new controls and operations management stuff. We were doing MES kind of stuff back in that day. And so it was great both professionally and personally. Like I said, my wife and I were newly married, so it really brought us together. We had each other, and we were the only two people we knew in that country when we arrived, and it was really good. It was just a really good life experience. And one of the things that we're probably touch on a bit as this progresses, but I learned a thing from the Australians that I have tried to keep in my mind in more or less over the years, but they have a very different idea about work as a culture. They work so that they can live.
Mhm.
They don't live to work. In the US, it's the norm for well, I'm working 10 or 12 hours a day and working up the ladder and all the things. In Australia, 5 o'clock, they're gone. And they just have a healthier, in my opinion, a healthier way
Mhm.
of thinking about what they do. They're working so they can get money so they can go out and live, and
Mhm.
versus the opposite thing. So that was cool. And so we did that. And then when we came back from Australia, we decided not to go back to Kansas City. We ended up in Portland, where I've been ever since. And that's when I got involved in the semiconductor industry, which with an Intel project, we spent a year in Ireland. My firstborn was 6 months old when we went there. And when we came back, my second kid was 6 months in the hopper. He was conceived in Ireland, and which he's always still embarrassed about when I tell that story. But that's one of the other things that comes out here is like the family dynamic. There's pluses and minuses to that as well, right? So those were the first two living abroad. The third and final story where I took the family was France, still in the semiconductor industry. A few years later, I think my kids, when we went there, were 4 and 6, and we spent 2 years in France, and none of us had any French at the time. I walked away still not having any. Nancy was able to, she wasn't working at the time. She was taking care of the kids, took the advantage of that opportunity to be with the kids for 2 years, which was great for them. And the kids were and still are, they came away totally fluent in French because they were still in that language acquisition phase of their lives. And my youngest, especially, he's still completely fluent and maybe completely random, but maybe not. He's actually today arrived. He just arrived in France. He's working on his PhD in physics, and has a fellowship. He's studying for 4 months in the same town that we lived in France, believe it or not. So that's my story of living in other places because of the work and because I sought it out and was engaged. And every time we went to a new place, learning new things about people and how they live their lives. And to me, that's really fascinating. And I think for me, at least, has given me a better perspective on how I want to live my life and how I interact with others in the world.